Okay, my parents came from Central Europe, you know, from the Balkans, and both my mother and my father, and they settled in Western Canada. And I was born in a small town in Western Canada. Actually, there wasn't a town there when I was born. It was a small school district. I went to a two-room public school, and I went to a two-room high school there. But the two rooms had their advantages because you listened to what the other kids were learning, and so I got finished with high school when I was 15 years old, and went on to university. And I liked mathematics a lot, and that's where I got my degree, was in mathematics. And then I faced a real life problems of getting a job, and of course couldn't get a job in mathematics, and I should have realized that when I went to school. But so I went back. I went to work at the National Research Council in Ottawa, and I was looking into what I would do when the war was over, and I asked the fellow who was in charge of the thing and had gone to Montreal for a sabbatical, and I said to him, Dr. Lawrence, so what's my future here? And he said, no. He said, it's unfortunate that you people didn't get your PhDs because of the war, but as soon as we're able to hire a PhD, he'll have your job, and you'll be working for him. And I went home that night and I said, I could work be a flunky for somebody the rest of my life. So within 2 weeks I quit, and I was going to get a job that would make enough money so that I could come to the United States and finish and get a graduate degree. Well, it turned out that the job didn't work very well, so I decided to go out to go and get a degree anyway. By this time, of course, because of the war, I couldn't get my visa. I couldn't get anything straightened out, and I went back to the University of Alberta, and I got a degree in physics. And I was supposed to do work on rubber physics, but there wasn't anybody in the department that knew anything about this. So then the next thing they asked me was, would I do some work in nuclear physics? So this is what I did. I got a degree in positive particles from beta ray sources and from uranium B. And that was what I worked at Alberta. I built a cloud chamber. I did quite a good work on that. And then I went back east, and by this time the war is over, and there's nobody as interested in nuclear physics at that time. You know, the demand was gone, so I couldn't get anything. So I started writing to some of the industrial companies, and there was a fellow. So I wrote to Mobile, and they asked me to come over. And it turned out that the fellow at Mobile, Jack Buck, who was head of the department at that time, in which I was hired after that, was a good friend of the guy who I worked with at the Research Council, Jack Morrison. And so Jack Buck called Morrison and said, how's this guy Kokotailo? And I guess I got a good recommendation because they hired me right away, see. And then I worked there, and I still didn't have my PhD, and I had all the intentions of 5 years, and I was going to get out and get a PhD. And then Buck told me, he said, well, you know, you can get this incentive scholarship from Mobile and go out, but he said, we would like you not to do that because we would have to go and hire somebody else to do the x-ray work, and because I was the only one doing x-ray work there at that time. So they made a deal with Temple University for me to go there and do my graduate work at Temple. And it wasn't an evening school, and it wasn't a day school. It was sort of in between. We started classes at 4 o'clock, and we were finished at 7 o'clock. So we took two 3-hour courses that way for 2 semesters, and that constituted our residence requirement at Temple. And I got my degree there, and I stayed on at Mobile. Of course, the interesting times with Mobile came when we first started on alumina catalysts, and we did a good job on that, tracing out the phase transformations in alumina, which were not in hydrated, and anhydrous alumina, which were not known. And then we got into zeolites, and that worked out very well with the solution of a whole bunch of structures. You know, what I have now, I think 9 structures that I have solved. The latest one was with ICI, and this has worked out very well. And then time came for me to leave Mobile to retire, and I retired about 2 years early. And there were a number of things that I wanted to clean up after I left Mobile, because either the company didn't have any interest or I didn't have any time to do. And one of them was that the alumina that was used in the reforming catalyst was really carefully prepared, and they always thought that the surface area was a direct function of the activity of the alumina catalyst, the platinum reforming catalyst. And yet, to me, when they put that, they would get a surface area of about 500 meters squared per gram. And when they would put it in a reactor, within about a half an hour, it would go down to 200, and the activity didn't change very much. So I was pretty sure that the surface area may have, that in getting the surface area, you did what you were supposed, what was the important thing, but that the surface area wasn't really directly related to the activity of the catalyst. So I decided when I left Mobile, I decided to get into a field to change fields so that I wouldn't be in conflict of interest with Mobile. So we went into NMR work. And that was one of the first things I did, and I found out that I was right, that it wasn't the surface area, that it was the coordination of the alumina that changed depending on how you treated it, so that the slow dehydration actually caused the coordination of the alumina to change. And this worked out fine. Now it would eventually go back, equilibrate, but it would take a long time. And so this was one, and of course one of the things that I did after I left Mobile, but then we got involved in zeolite work with NMR, and of course their aim there was much different from what it was at Mobile, that we wanted as high a silica-alumina ratio as possible, and then we would steam it down to even for a higher silica-alumina ratio so that we could get very good NMR spectra. And of course the spectra Fife got in his lab was never equaled by anyone else. And that was not mainly due to their equipment, but also due to the sample preparations. So it worked out very well. I had two students at Guelph. They each had 20 papers before they got their PhDs. And this was all based on, I had a lot of these problems in the back of my head, and I said, you guys want to work on them? Fine. And that's what they did. And we had an awful lot of work. So on basis of what we did at Guelph, I got the Humboldt Award in Germany, and Fife got the Killam Award in Canada, which gave him $50,000 a year for 2 years. So the year and a half that I spent there was quite profitable. And we did a lot of things. Now we have a beta zeolite material that we can distinguish over beta, and so that there's an interest in beta now. So we have something and we have an idea of what the structure is. And the other thing is we made a ZSM-11 that was fault-free, that they couldn't make before. And so there were a lot of interesting things accomplished that way. And we got enough of a background in how to correlate structural changes with NMR. And for instance, the absorption of materials or temperature would change the structure of ZSM-5, it would change the structure of ZSM-11, it changed the structure of ZSM-39. Temperature differences weren't very great. You know, you have a phase transformation of ZSM-39 at about 110 degrees, ZSM-11 at about 100 degrees, and ZSM-5 at about 100 degrees centigrade. And so these things all came out it was quite interesting to see that absorption would change these things. Now there's still the problem as why is it doing this, or how is it doing it, or what was the effect. And so this generated a lot of interest in continuing with this kind of work. And we did a lot of synthesis work at Guelph. We had to do, because we couldn't get any samples from anybody, from any of the companies. So we had to synthesize our own material. Then I went to Germany, and of course, for a year in Germany, and the work that we did there was mainly on absorption and catalysis rather than diffusion, rather than structure, although we used the structure work to determine what the materials that we synthesized, whether they were okay or not. And so we did some work on diffusion in larger crystals of ZSM5, and we did at Mainz, where I worked with a fellow named Mueller there, and they showed the hysteresis effect in ZSM5, and with almost all sorts of adsorbents, including nitrogen, you had a hysteresis effect. And then I worked with a fellow named Tissler, and he did some work on looking at the lattice parameters of ZSM5 as a function of temperature and as a function of silica agglomeration. And we got a lot of interesting work done along that line. This fellow was doing his diploma arbeit, which is they have to do a 6-month project after to get their bachelor's, to get their degree. And it worked out pretty well. And then I came back to the United States, and I continued collaborating with Fife, and we got involved in two-dimensional NMR, which we could now determine the connectivities of the different sites, like the crystallographic sites like for instance in ZSM39, we knew that T1 was coordinated to T2 through oxygen atoms, and T2 was coordinated to T3, but T3 was not coordinated to T1. And so this was interesting because it showed that the structure was right, because you couldn't get enough data. The crystals weren't large enough or good enough you had to speculate on a lot of this. But now we have an independent method of corroborating some of this data. And so that worked out. And of course, I got back and I had to get a lab to do some work in, and I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and I made a deal with them so that I didn't want a job with them. I made a deal with them that I would help them start a synthesis program if I could get lab facilities to do some of my own research work. And so I'm interested right now in doing some diffusion work. As I said previously, the adsorption of materials, of organic materials in ZSM5 changes there's a phase transformation in the structure, and you can determine the adsorption by tracking the phase transformation. And we think that there is a surface barrier in some of these materials, that it takes some time to break through this barrier, and once you break through it, then it goes through easily. We did some work on orthoxylene adsorption of ZSM5, and we developed a cell for the X-ray diffraction work, and we covered this sample with a collodion film so that we didn't have any evaporation, and we looked at we adsorbed orthoxylene, and we ran the X-ray pattern. 3 hours, nothing changed. 12 hours, nothing changed. 24 hours, nothing changed. 2 days, nothing. And Tissler said, well, I don't think anything's going to happen. I said, well, leave it in for another day. At 3 days, completely gone. And so we want now to continue some of this work to see what is happening there, and can we use some other species? There was a theory that the orthoxylene may be converting to paraxylene, and then the paraxylene was absorbed, but we find out that that's not the case, and that orthoxylene is being absorbed. And so we want now to look at what is the effect of silica lunar ratio, crystallite size, and to get a better handle on exactly whether this is a sudden, because we will now have to take X-ray patterns at shorter intervals to get an idea of how this thing goes over, whether it is a sudden thing or whether it increases with time. And so this has been, and I have a few ideas on synthesis that I would like to use to develop some new CLIs. I would like to look to see the use of zeolites, or the synthesis of zeolites, expanded. I think this is, right now there seems to be a drop in interest in the synthesis of zeolites, because very few new zeolites have been developed. Although you can see here at this meeting that the work by Grace on titanium shows that there is interest in new zeolites. My main thing is to develop two-dimensional channel systems, and I have a paper that I'm giving in Amsterdam on this. But there are a number of possible zeolites that can be made by just using the kind of transformations that have already been observed. You know, you can rotate planes with ophrotite and come up with aragonite. You can do the same thing with melanite and get cavesite. You can shift planes just like in clinotile and come out with different pore system than you had previously, which makes it more selective for clinotile. There's a rotation of planes like in ZSM-5 and ZSM-11. These are the techniques that I was using. So I took known zeolites and determined how you can, by rotating planes, sliding planes, or to convert a zeolite from a one-dimensional channel system to a two-dimensional channel system, changing the size of the channels by doing this. So I have one in which it is a 10-membered ring, it's a one-dimensional 10-membered ring system, and by rotating, by sliding planes, I was able to make it into a two-dimensional channel system with 11 and a 12, 10 and a 12-membered ring. And then by rotating another set of planes, I was able to make it into a two-dimensional 11-membered ring system, which I thought was fairly interesting, because now you're closing the gap between 10 and 12-membered rings, so you have greater flexibility in getting absorption. And so I can show with about 15 models how you can get a 7-membered ring, a 9, an 8-membered ring, a 9, and then a 10, 11, and a 12-membered two-dimensional channel systems, 2 or 3-dimensional channel systems. And the only zeolites that have really panned out as far as economic viability are the ones that are two-dimensional channels or three-dimensional, DSM-5 and phlogisite, if you want to have an opening greater than an 8-membered ring. And the others, orgonite's okay, but it still isn't the catalyst that phlogisite or ZSM-5 is. So these are the things that are of interest to me right now.
One of the people that no longer is around is Julius Syric. Would you care to describe Julius?
Well, Julius was probably the most innovative person as far as zeolite synthesis is concerned. I worked with him very closely for a number of years before he died, and he probably synthesized more zeolites for mobile than anybody else at mobile. And he did this with just sheer ingenuity. He synthesized, in some cases, the template, like triquat. He synthesized the template. We worked out the structure of the template. We predicted what kind of a pore system it should have based on the template. And then we worked out, tried to get the structure out. We didn't succeed, but I think we know what the structure is now. He was the one that did the work on crystal growth. He grew large crystals of zeolite A. He was the first one to do this, and he did an awful lot of work in not only in zeolites, but he didn't get any credit for doing this. He worked for Chernobyl, and he developed a catalyst in which they put platinum and iridium on different particles. So they put platinum on one set of particles of alumina and iridium on another set, and then they mixed them up. And it worked out very well. It was worked out to be a fairly good catalyst. And if he had continued on that, it would have probably been successful. But I think this is getting close to the time when he was getting sick. And the stuff was published and publicized, but Julius never got any credit for it, but I don't have to tell you that. It's happened a number of times. And, so this was the thing, that Chernobyl got the patents, and Sirik never even got honorable mention of this. Now, what was sort of interesting, that he synthesized a material called ZSM-18, and they never tried. Of course, they never did any, because he wasn't in favor. They never really tried to exploit any of the materials that he made. ZSM-18 was one. ZSM-20. Now they're doing it because they're realizing that they're important, and other people are trying to get ZSM-20. But Sirik was the one that developed ZSM-20 and ZSM-3. These are analogs of fudge sour, X and Y, and they have the 20s and 3 were interesting because it was a three-dimensional channel system, but the channels were all 12-membered rings, but they were different shapes and sizes, so that you actually had two sets of channels in there. The ones that were perpendicular to the c-axis and the ones that were parallel to the c-axis. The ones that were parallel to the c-axis were the same as in fortisite. The other ones were sort of elliptical and were the equivalent of 10-membered rings. And so this was quite interesting. But, 5 years after he died, or 6 years after he died, now they're very interested and they're trying to find samples of ZSM-18, and they're not able to reproduce ZSM-18. But if he was there, he'd have done it like that. And here's Julius, I would like to just mention one thing here. That George Kerr developed ZK5, which was an interesting material. It wasn't very stable, but was interesting. And it was one of the first new zeolites that was synthesized at Mobile. When George went to Princeton, he couldn't reproduce ZK5. Well, for whatever reason, I don't know. All he was getting was leavenite and some other materials, but he couldn't get ZK5. And I had a sample of it, and it had gone amorphous. So it was about 2 or 3 years later, and it had gone amorphous. I guess if I had calcined it, it would have been okay. But I went to Julius and I said, "Hey, can you make me some ZK5?" I says, "Kerr says he can't make it anymore." And about 5 days later, he came with a sample, and there it was, ZK5. He had no problem doing any of this stuff, He's just like the gardener. He had a green thumb, But he wasn't appreciated there, and I don't know, I guess it was a little difficult to get along with, but I think Mobile lost by not, all you have to do is give him a problem and say solve it, instead of trying to tell him how to solve it. And this was Julius's. Chernobyl tried to put him in a spot where he wouldn't succeed at something, and so Julius is 50 years old, and he's going to try and get him to do computer programming. And thinking that he wouldn't succeed because he's too old to pick up these new things. Well, within about 3 or 4 months, Julius could outdo Chernobyl in all the programming, and Chernobyl very quickly backed out of the thing. But that was Julius, and he was a very interesting person, very innovative. I hate the term, but he was a good man, and I think he was badly used there. Now, I think they're looking through all his notebooks and trying to find out what he had done. But Julius was probably like me. He never put all his ideas in his notebooks, and so they couldn't even reproduce. Because somebody called me up and wanted to know if I had some ZSM-18, and I said I didn't. But we are able to reproduce the ZSM-18 now, and at a much higher silicon lumen ratio. And I think Julius, by the way, all this stuff that the emphasis on de-illuminating and replacing with silicon chloride, hexachloride, was Julius's idea. He did this long before any of this came into the literature, but Mobile wasn't. You see, that first Mobile was in high silicon materials, but they could have increased the silicon lumen ratio of X and Y and done very well. but they never followed that through. And yet he was, I can show you evidence that he had done this long before Bayer or Breck or Skills that Carbide had done it, and he did it very, very simply. And but they had a man, but they never took advantage of him. So he was an interesting guy.
What made him interesting?
Well, he was first. It was his background. He came from Europe. He was a partisan. He, in the Yugoslav political system there, he had a very interesting life. He went to Darmstadt in Germany and got his degree in there, and he saved his professor's life in a bombing raid, and this guy was ever grateful to him forever after. And so then he escaped from the Central Europe, and he went to Canada, and he worked in a pulp and paper mill there for a while, and then he went to University of Toronto, and he had no trouble. But he could pick things up. Here's something that had nothing to do with science. Got very interested in musical instruments, and he went and studied and put together on how to build a violin, and used electronic ways of determining the sound production with these instruments, and really did it very well. He was one of the first ones to show that the varnish that Stradivarius used was nothing unusual and didn't do anything for the sound. It was there just to protect the instrument, and it wasn't. And he reproduced the varnish that those guys did, and that Stradivarius and Amati and the others, and he made some. He developed a computer program to how to section the various parts of the violin and put them together. Because you have to. The shape of the violin is such that you have to cut it from the top and from the bottom, to give it the shape, to get a good cross section. And he had a computer program that told you exactly how to do that. So this was essentially some work that he never wasn't involved with. Was no law on that. That was one of the things that he did. He was a real good musician too. I remember him coming to our house, and my boy who played a lot of musical instruments, and Julius got his guitar out, and it was a classical guitar, and my son couldn't believe that he could play that well, that he was that good at it. So he was just a versatile person, he did all sorts of things, and made the equipment himself. Like he would make wood chisels by tempering them and filing them down and getting them in the right shape so that he could cut. He did a lot of wood embroidery work, the wood carving. And so that all in all, of course this is the sign of a very capable person, or a very productive person. And it's too bad that he didn't. I was asked to write his obituary, and by the journal Zeolites, and it was sort of interesting. I mean, you may not even know this, that Schwartz asked him to. They were trying to make at that time methanol out of gasoline instead of the reverse. And because gasoline was so cheap that you could make methanol out of it. And so they were using this fungicide catalyst, and it turned out that they were getting the reverse. They were getting gasoline out of methanol. It wasn't a very good quality gasoline, but it was there. He was told to cut this thing out, not to publish it at all, not to do anything about it, that they weren't interested in it at all. Well, Venuto and Lyle Hamilton, and they published that book or that chapter in that book on applications of zeolites, and they published his the product distribution of the material that they got with this from methanol. And so, all these credits that are given to people for getting gasoline out of methanol is nonsense, because Zurich was the first one to do that, and it has been published, even though they refer to an unpublished paper by Zurich, but they have the product output that shows this. And so when I put it in the and by the way, I asked Phil Landis if that was true. That was what he had done, and Landis said, of course it was. We put out his data sheet on there showing that it was done, and yet no one has given him credit for being the first one to get the MTG, methanol to gasoline. And they didn't even want to make a few trials to get this thing, published or in the literature or patent-wise. We just let go. And but there was Zurich, he did it, and that's why I say that's where they lost out, because when Schwartz asked him to do that, he did it, and he got the job done. If he had been told you do this and that, he would have said, you don't need me, you get a technician to do that. that was his arguments. Well, I hope I've given you a fairly good description of what Zurich was. He was an interesting person, and I got along with him very well. He did a lot of interesting work that should have been more recognized than it was. It is now, but it's too late to help him out.
Do you remember the professor's name that he saved your life of?
At Darmstadt?
Mm-hmm.
No, I can't remember his name. The one that was, but I think I can find out who it is. I think that there's a fellow in Germany who would tell me what his name was. But he was very appreciative, because they were bombed. They went to the labs at night because that was the safest place, you see. But the university got bombed. By the way, I went back there. I went to Darmstadt, and I went to the university.
Do you know how he came to go to Germany from?
That I don't know. You see, and as a matter of fact, Rickert, who's in Germany, told me, who went to Darmstadt about the same time, said he couldn't understand how Zurich went there when it was during the war. It was right. The war was on already, and how he got there. But I guess he got there because the Germans were very would give very strict examinations for the people coming in, and knowing Zurich, he would have passed them with flying colors, and they probably just got him because he was a very capable person. Because Rickert said to me, that he couldn't understand how Zurich got there when some of the German people couldn't get in. But you see, the university is looking for capable people, regardless of where they're from, and so that's how I think he got there. But he was a character, all right. But you see, that's what made him what he is. Yeah. He's got a daughter now that who has a PhD from Princeton University, and in chemical engineering. And she could have gone into any other field, but I think she was just trying to show that she's her father's daughter, and she's got a degree in chemical engineering and is doing very well in the computing field. And right now she's finishing up. I think she's going to go to the University of Cincinnati, but as on staff there, but I'm not sure exactly what she's going to do. But she's done very well. She has another daughter who's doing computer programming for Boeing aircraft. And another daughter who's involved in running a cable television station. So these kids. He passed some of the stuff off to his kids.
Or anything else that you?
Well,
George Kerr.
Oh, George Kerr was an interesting guy. He came to Mobile and. Around around the time that we were getting started on zeolites, and everybody was trying to duplicate A and X. And you know, now with everybody synthesizing all these materials, you'd wonder why anybody had any trouble synthesizing A and X. And I used to have a lot of fun with this, like when Kerr went through all these troubles, and he could make A and X very well. And then other people at Mobile started doing the same thing. And they used to get upset with me when I would say, well, you're at the stage where Kerr was about a year ago, you know, and that's how you're. And when Rosinski started working on it, and Planck, and they had their problems. But Kerr did very well. He came there, and he wasn't willing to just duplicate until he made, after he made ZSM, or synthesized zeolite A and X, he started to do something, other things. And he was the first one to put organic materials in and start what is now the high silica aluminum materials. He was the first one in '61 to get a high silica A by using an organic template. And you should give him credit for that, because he did. He was the first one to synthesize a new zeolite with organic materials. And he went on afterwards and did quite a bit of work. He, again, like Kerr, got into difficulties with management, and I think that they lost, the company lost, and of course George Kerr lost too. Well, you can't say he didn't lose, because he did. But he was a very capable person. He had a very good background in organic chemistry, which is what they needed. See, the trouble with a lot of people is that it's the inorganic chemists that do that, and we have the same problem with NMR. The NMR people don't know any zeolite work, and the zeolite people don't know any NMR, and so you lose out in that unless you have a group that are working together and are very good at it. Kerr was the same way, but Kerr did very well, and Kerr synthesized beta and ZK5 and a number of others and between me and you, Kerr synthesized ZSM5. I mean, from the patent standpoint, because they started out with tetraethyl, tetramethyl, and then the next one was tetrapropyl, and they were going to work on tetrapropyl when he moved to Princeton, and they had everything set to do the tetrapropyl, and he moved to Princeton. Bob Landolt decided not to go to Princeton. He was the technician, so he stayed back. And he continued, because Mobile was in a state of flux as far as management was concerned at that time. They had gone from being run by the management, by the manufacturing committee, to being run by the corporate. And so people were doing whatever they wanted, whatever they thought was important, you know. And so they let Landolt do some of his own things, and he just continued the work that George Kerr had planned out, and that's where they got the ZSM5. So in this way, I don't think any patent attorney would take ZSM5 away from Kerr, because he was the one that got Landolt going on this. The guy who got credit for it was the guy who came in and happened to be Landolt's boss, but knew nothing about it, and that was Hargauer. He wasn't involved, although I'm sure right now he's taking advantage of that. But Kerr should have got more of the credit for that. And he did so many things there. He determined what effect temperature, humidity and water vapor had on the de-illumination of materials, the stability of X and Y, and he was the one that de-illuminated X and Y with steam, and he's the one with the deep bed calcination. That was his work. He's done an awful lot of work. As I said, as in the case of Zurich, they were entirely different, but in a way they were very much the same, because they were very capable people who the company did not take advantage of.
Now, how did he get ZK5 recognized and then they quit labeling the zeolites that way?
Well, you see, that's how I know what they did, because I did the analysis work for these people. The ZK4, as a matter of fact, I probably got credit, which I shouldn't say I probably, I did get credit, which I didn't deserve, because it was George Kokotailo that synthesized ZK4, which is a high silica form of A, in which he used the organic base, so that he was the first one to do this. The paper that was published by Kerr and myself, because I showed him that it was different from A. So I did the characterization work, but it was his synthesis, not mine. But and then of course ZK5, we did the same thing. That was the first zeolite was made from an organic base. We wouldn't determine the structure of it. Walter Meyer and I determined the structure of ZK5, which was an interesting structure. But this is what happened. Kerr, and that's how I knew what Kerr did, because I worked with him on some of these things. And so he discussed, like Sirik did. Sirik discussed these things with me. When he made that catalyst, when Sirik, to get back to Sirik, when he made a catalyst with platinum on one set of particles and iridium on the other set of particles, because iridium was very sensitive to treatment. And I said to him, you have to keep moisture out. You have to watch out your calcination, or how you calcine this thing, because the crystallite size will grow, and you cannot rejuvenate it the same way as you can platinum. So I told Sirik, I said, before you give this, before you test this sample, let me look at it, and I'll be able to tell you whether the crystallite size of platinum and iridium is okay. And we had a neat trick for doing that. We pulled the slits out of the X-ray unit and ran it almost, because you're running at a high angle, the resolution was still fairly good, but you got 20 times the intensity. And like Bartel asked me, you ever put this in a notebook so that other people would say, no? I said, well, let these guys find out for themselves. This was a trick that we used. And so when Sirik gave me the sample, and I said, your iridium has grown. You've got a large crystallite size, so the catalytic activity of the iridium is not going to be right. And so I said, try it again. Make sure you keep the moisture out and dry it very carefully. And he came the next time, and the iridium was 20 angstrom unit particles, and that's what impressed Chernobyl, because the first catalyst that Sirik made was very good, even though he didn't know that we had culled out some of them before that.
Well, how did the ZK series of zeolites end?
Yeah, let me point that out to you. The ZK was zeolite Kerr, you see, and Sirik was. Here's another thing that shows you the character of Sirik. Sirik said, "This is not my material; it's the company's material, and I shouldn't put my name on it." So he made he developed a notation of ZSM, which meant zeolite zirconium mobile, and that's when he started it. And there's a standard joke, which there's more truth to than people think, that when Meisel became head of that, the SM was his initials, and so the others adopted it. Even though the only guy who didn't was Cool, but his materials never got anywhere, and so Gunther Cool still continued with the ZK. So you have ZK15, ZK16, but they were Gunther Cools, but you never hear anyone mentioning them. But the ZSM was continued, and so the ZSM 3, 4 were Siriks. The 5 was Landol's. The 6 was Siriks, and then he went on. The ZSM 7 was unstable. The 8 was May Rubens, and it was and you had ZSM 10 was Sirik, ZSM 11 was Pochu's. They went with the ZSM after that, and I think it was strictly because of Meisel. And Meisel used that afterwards. He said, he sort of joked that they named it's a zeolite Cy Meisel, not zeolite Ciccone Mogul. But now they've abandoned that. Now they are not using ZSM anymore. It's MCM, which means mobile crystalline materials.
What about May Rubin?
Well, May Rubin is another interesting person. She was a hard worker. She did a lot of interesting things there, but I don't think she got the credit for what she did. She actually, GSM 11 was hers, but she didn't get the credit for it. And they didn't use the GSM 8 that she developed, was abandoned, and I still think that's a new material. But that's neither here nor there. That's out. But she didn't get it. But she did come up with a number of materials, which she is on as co-author with Rosinski and Planck. But I think that most of the credit should have gone to her, like CSM 12, which is her material, and then she had a number of others. CSM 12 was hers, CSM 8. She had some of the others. I think GSM 35 was hers, and 38, and then she had. But she did a lot of the synthetic Mordnite was hers. The GSM 42, I think, was hers. But they didn't patent that in time, so she never got credit for that. She was a very capable person. She did a lot of good work for the company. She was quite an interesting person. She said her say, and it didn't make any difference who she said it to. You would have thought that she would get along with Schwartz, but she didn't. I was in an interesting situation there because I dealt with all of these people, including you when you were there, because everyone that had anything that they wanted to identify or to characterize, they came to me. And I guess I was a little different from normal analytical people, that they were interested in solving a problem, not just giving results, data. And the products people were a good example of that. They wanted me to solve their problem for them, not to just tell them whether they had a crystalline material and what the crystalline material was. And so as a result, I was pretty familiar with all the work that was done, including the work that Brennan did. Brennan did some interesting work on the growth of carbon fibers. As a matter of fact, he never published it because the company wouldn't let him. But if you take an acetylene torch and direct it on a stainless steel grid, you'll start growing carbon fibers off the grid. And they were very interesting because depending on the temperature and the pressure, you could change the size of the fibers. You could get hollow fibers, but the tips of all these fibers were iron, and they were the catalyst that made the fiber grow. And we did some X-ray work on it and showed that the crystals were all oriented. The graphite planes were all oriented. Some had a solid core that was different structure from the outside. Some had a hollow core. He did a lot of interesting work on that. Here again, they never got the credit for it. He saw me after he retired, and he said that he saw a publication of somebody who was publishing what he had done 15 years earlier. But now there's somebody here talking about iron, carbon filaments from iron, and using that were growing out of iron. And we felt that the Fischer-Tropsch catalyst, you could tell whether the carbon filaments grew out of the iron. But the tip was iron, and you could tell that it was the catalyst, and that caused the growth. Well, Brennan was another free thinker. he had some he had some interesting stories to tell. I'll never forget him telling me about when he was at graduate school, and his guide would trick some of these girls into stripping to get pictures taken by thinking that they were going to be published, you see. And he went with this guy, and he had a camera, but he didn't have any film in it. He was taking pictures of these women who were stripping. Yeah, so there was a fellow there that I guess he was there before you. Did you ever know of anybody named Mike Fontana?
I've heard the name.
Yeah, he was a real character, a bright guy, but he got into difficulties and he left. He wasn't there very long, but he was really a bright guy. I don't know, Mobile attracted some of those. So a lot of there was a few of them that came there. They didn't stay very long. Greg Wanier, who was a physicist, he was one of the top-notch physicists. He went from Mobile to Bell Labs and did very well there. Went back to Switzerland, wrote a number of books, and then he ended up at the University of Washington. And he was quite a character, and did some interesting work for them. But it was at the end of the war, and I guess there was a lot of flux, you know, people moving from one place to the other because war industries were collapsing. You see, the war, these people moved from one place to another, and Mobile got a few of them, and it worked out. And I think this is what made Mobile really, because somebody at Mobile decided that they needed a research lab, not a technical service lab, which is what they had, product control. And they got it, but they never really had anybody at the top who would have directed it, you know, who would have determined the thing, the type of work that was done. And so what happened was that everybody started going on their own, and then some of these guys panned out, you know, but once they got past that, by the time you came, the management were trying to take control of the whole thing, and that's when the failure came. See, this is when they wanted you to project proposals on a yearly basis, and then on a 6-month basis, and then it got to be a 3-month basis with reviews every month, and you know that was you know, an inhibitor, because you wouldn't nobody would go out on a limb to do something. And you know, it's old business, the minimal risk. You just try to engineer something to get a 0.5% gain or a 1% gain, because that was the minimal risk. And that's what happened there. So you haven't seen very much coming out of Mobile, although a lot of people thought that a lot should come out of Mobile in the last 10 years, and we didn't see it. That was sort of amusing to me as to what Miles told me. Nothing is coming out of the labs. That's when I was leaving. And I said to him, nothing will come out of the labs the way you're running them. I said, you have to get some good people and give them free rein. And if they don't produce, then move them out. Then put them into a place where where they will do what is required of them. But keep the guys, the free thinkers, the guys who are going to really come up with the good ideas, free to do what they can do. But they never did that. See, you had a few that got to the top that never got there through accomplishment, and they were going to try and determine what other people. Well, like in my case, the guy tried to tell me how to run a microscope when he can't turn it on. This is the sort, but I'm sure this is true of a lot of other companies. Mobile wasn't alone in that.
No.
And actually, one of the things that got Mobile going was Schiessler, because Schiessler came from a university atmosphere, and they didn't have a management who could tell Schiessler what to do. And they were really looking for somebody to tell them what they should do, not the reverse. And this is where they came around. And Schiessler felt that the zeolites were similar to the thiourea haddock catalyst, and you should be able to make a porous material with silica rather than with carbon, like the thiourea adducts. And it turned out that that was it. But when George Kerr came there, Schiessler told him that he didn't expect to get very much out of Kerr for 5 years, but that he was to scope as they say, the whole thing and see what could be done. Didn't take George Kerr 5 years. It took him a lot less, but it worked out. A combination of things. Some of it was luck, but a lot of it was George Kerr's initiative that did this. And you can look at it now and say, well, putting an organic base was not that innovative. It was at that time because nobody else had done it, and it started a whole industry. So Kerr did a phenomenal job there.
Good morning. Welcome to the third plenary session. Just two fast announcements before I turn the meeting over to Maurice Mitchell. One, I think most of you have already discovered that yesterday the registration list